Last fall, I was invited to go down to South Carolina again for the second time, and I've been invited back for the third time. But they have a festival down there called Stone Soup Storytelling Festival, and I was going to be one of the featured tellers last April. And when I was invited down, basically it's a bunch of concerts. They have different types of storytelling, so personal tales like the Moth. They'll have a group of storytellers come and do these moth type stories. And then they'll have folk tellers like myself will come down and tell different types of folk tales. And then there's other ones that make up their own humorous stories, so they have that kind of a concert. They have a liars contest. I don't know if any of you have ever made it to go to that. Liars contest, they're stylized lies. They're not, like, oh yeah, I stayed home last night, honest. No, they're more like, well, we went out fishing and it was a really dry day and there was no fish around, so I couldn't find any bait, and then I saw a frog out in the swamp, and as I was going to get the swamp, some snake grabbed it, and I tried to pull it away from the snake, but the snake wouldn't let go of it. And then I remembered I had some of my medicine in the back pocket, Dr. McGillicuddy. Yeah, he's a good doctor, right? Anyway, I figured I'm losing this battle with the snake, so I slip off the top and I pour a little Dr. McGillicuddy down the side of the snake's throat, and boom, he let go of that frog real quick. Yeah, so I got to go fishing, and I'm fishing away, and a few minutes later I see the snake coming up with another frog. That's a lie, right? But that's the kind of stories. They're shooting 20 turkeys with the same bullet, and it just goes pop, 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 pop all the way through them because you lined it up right. Great thing. But this year they decided they weren't going to have a liars contest. Which I thought, what, really? And they said, we have a special storyteller coming, but since the COVID shutdowns, he's been doing this show once a month. It's called it's fairy tale variations. So one storyteller will tell a version of a story that's a traditional version, and then the other tellers will make up these other versions that could be fun, they could be beautiful, whatever they want to do, but something that's not the same story but is based on that. And so I said, sure, if I can be the traditional teller, because I'm not interested in coming up with these wild and crazy things. And they said, yeah, you could be the traditional teller. And then I'm talking with the other storytellers, and they wanted to do something like really well known, like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or Cinderella. And I'm like, oh, I've only got 15 minutes to tell this story. First of all, you can't do one of those, because if I tell a traditional version, it's going to be 30 minutes long. We don't have that much time. And they're like, oh, but I said, why don't we tell something like the Pied Piper? Nah, not the Pied Piper. No, not the Pied. Finally, we decided to go with Rapunzel. Yes. Now, we all know Rapunzel. It comes from the Grimm brothers, but that was actually the last version of this tale in Western civilization. The story comes from Babylon. It was part of the mythology, and when Babylon fell, this little piece of a story traveled around Mesopotamia and out through Arabia, and by the 1500s, thousands of years later, there are thousands of versions of Maiden in a Tower, the story of some pregnant woman who has terrible cravings and ends up going into a magic user's garden to satisfy it. And the magic user threatens her life, and she has to trade the unborn child for her life, and the child's born, named after the whatever vegetable it was in the story, and she ends up in a tower someplace, has to be rescued. Well, by the time 1500 came along, there were 3 versions that had traveled down the spice roads, traveled through the what do they call those things, those wars we used to have? Crusades, right. Up the Crusade trails. Anyway, there are 3 versions in Naples, and the printing press is running, and they decide they want to do a book. This guy named Basil, he figures he's going to do a storybook, and he finds 3 versions of Maiden in a Tower, selects 2 of them, puts them into his book, and that's the first literary version. Then, 100 years later, a Frenchman wants to do something for the courts. He writes out a courtly version of it. The little girl's name, Parsley. And some German sees this second book and says, wow, what a great idea. I should do that one of those in Germany. So he writes this book of stories in Germany. And he likes that parsley story, but he says, you know, in Germany, we don't eat a lot of parsley. We eat this lettuce. And in fact, this particular lettuce is our version of food. So that particular version of lettuce was Rapunzel. This is the book 100 years later that the Grimm brothers find when they're searching for stories to put into their book of stories. And they say, oh, this must be an old German folk tale because it's about Rapunzel. And Rapunzel's a German vegetable, so this is an old German story. Wonderful, we'll put it into our book. And they did not know that the literary history of this, because we didn't study literary history at that time. They were trying to write a dictionary because there weren't any German dictionaries at the time. I mean, we're talking about a long time ago. Well, our translators got a hold of it and they translated into English. And the rule in translation for English is not to translate the names of people. So Rapunzel stayed Rapunzel instead of getting translated properly to lettuce. Right. So we don't get to hear that person call out, lettuce, lettuce, let down your sweet hair. Rapunzel. They also were Christians, and Christianity was pretty tight at that time, and they weren't allowed to have pregnant women in their stories. So poor Rapunzel, who was pregnant before she got out of the tower, lost that pregnancy, and so the ending got really strange. And I really don't like the story Rapunzel translated out of German from the Grimm brothers. Okay. But I really liked those three folk tales back in Naples in the 1500s. So I took those three stories and I started telling them to Americans, adult Americans, because that's my audience going to be at the festival. And I just find some people, I say, I'd like to tell you a story, I'd like to tell you a story. And I keep on telling the stories and I find out which elements in those stories people like. And once I've done that, identified which of the different types of things in these stories they like, I take those elements out and I put them together to make one story. And I take that story around and start telling it to people and watching their faces and figuring out where it is that it's strong, where it's weak, where I need to change it. And this is what I ended up with. This is the tale of the sorcerer who wanted to live forever. And he put all his efforts towards that goal. All of his wealth, all of his time was spent traveling the corners of the earth, searching for the secret of immortality. And he found it. A complex formula, a specialized ritual which produced the elixir of eternal life. There was just one problem. The primary ingredient of this elixir was the blood of a 21-year-old virgin. And in those days, in that place, women were free, they did what they wanted, and most of them had wanted to explore life and love long before 21. So there just weren't any virgins of that age to be found. So the sorcerer, he has to put his mind to different projects, other ways to get women to do what he wants, in hopes that someday he'll obtain that elusive ingredient. And he has some success with poppies. Poppies! Yes, breeding them with household herbs. Ends up with this particularly potent rosemary bush. And as rosemary is both medicinal and culinary, he has no problem getting it into the local shop. A couple of doses of his rosemary and you'd be hooked, be back for more. And so his wealth and his influence increased. Now one of those people was a young woman, a singer of songs. And she had been out exploring life and love enough to have created a new life to love. And in her pregnancy, she was experiencing some very strong cravings. And not understanding about the machinations of the sorcerer, she added a little of his herb to her meal and found herself with a habit she could not afford on a singer's salary. Which means one night she found herself sitting alone in her apartment, going through the agonies of withdrawal. when she smelled the scent of that herb she so desired, and looking out the window, she saw it in her neighbor's garden, glowing beautiful silvery blue in the moonlight, a rosemary bush. And even though she'd heard from her friends that guy next door was some kind of lecherous pervert, she snuck into the garden and broke off a sprig. But there's no sneaking into a sorcerer's garden. He steps out of the shadows before she can reach the gate. And he's really mad. You dare steal from me! She's so scared she falls under this. She says, please sir, I'm pregnant. I couldn't help myself. It's the cravings. He goes, pregnant? The anger drains from him as he realizes his opportunity. I understand. Please, take all the rosemary you want. But promise me your child. If it's a girl, when she reaches the appropriate age, apprentice her to me. And I promise you, I will protect her reputation. Keep her safe, and when she's 21, she'll have a trade. And so that woman, thinking she was fortunate, promised her unborn child to the sorcerer, and left with a large basket of rosemary. Well, the child was born. It was a girl, and they named her Rosemary after her mother's hook. But little Rosemary sang. At first she cooed the croonings her mother sang at her cradle. Next she mimicked her mom backstage as her mother performed. Then she started singing anything she heard. She just plucked it out of the air, first hearing like magic. After that she began to mix notes and words into melodies that mesmerized her listeners. Then she turned 7, started school. And as she sang her way home from school each day, she would walk past the sorcerer's house. And he would open up his window and he would say, Rosemary, remind your mother of her promise. So little Rosemary, she'd go home and she'd see her mom, she'd say, Mama, the man next door says, remember your promise. And her mother would say, just ignore him. She didn't want to lose her daughter. But that meant that every day, as Rosemary sang her way home from school, the sorcerer would call out, Rosemary, remind your mother of her promise. Her mother would say, just ignore him. Until one day she didn't. Might have been the drugs. She might have just been hangry, I don't know. But that day she was beside herself and she said, tell him just take it. So the next day when Rosemary sang her way home from school, the sorcerer called out, Rosemary! And she replied, she says just take it. So he reached out the window and he grabbed the little girl, pulled her in, locked her up in the garret, and he never let her out. But Rosemary sang. She sang every song she'd ever sung, and then she made up new songs to sing. And the sorcerer began to notice that out in front of his house, out in the road, the people began to gather and listen to Rosemary singing. And he didn't care, because he liked it too. Until she turned 14. When he began to notice that most of the people out in front of the house were young men. And that made him nervous, because he still had 7 more years. And he really wanted to live forever. So he conjured a tower far out in the wilderness where no one ever went. It was 70 feet tall, window way at the top, only way in or out. And he put Rosemary up into that tower and he spelled her hair. It grew long and thick and strong. And they braided it into a rope, and she would sit in a chair by the window and hook the top of the braid to a hook at the top of the window. And she'd throw all the rest out whenever the sorcerer called, Rosemary, Rosemary, let down your sweet hair. He would scramble up and spend his day sitting at his sorcerer's workbench, creating potions and spells and listening to Rosemary sing. He had her all to himself. But as Rosemary grew into her maidenhood, the sorcerer began to have a new problem. You see, his masculine desires began to interfere with his long-term goals. And he realized he couldn't spend so much time alone in the tower with Rosemary. So he took to coming just once a day. Early in the morning, he would come, he would call, he would climb, he'd leave her the things she needed that day, climb back down, he'd be gone. And that's when the hunter showed up. A young man out in the wilderness searching for some great beast to prove his manhood. He hears the singing from the wind, wanders along, comes within sight of the tower just about the time the sorcerer shows up. Hears him call, "Rosemary, Rosemary, let down your sweet hair." Sees him climb. A few minutes later, he climbs back down and he's gone, and the hunter thinks, I'd like to try that. So he goes to the window, calls, "Rosemary, Rosemary, let down your sweet hair." And Rosemary, thinking it's just the sorcerer came back for some reason, drops down the braid. He scrambles up, and isn't she surprised to see a young man at her window? Well, she's afraid. But he reassures her, "Don't be scared. I heard you singing. It was so beautiful, almost as beautiful as you." Well, flattery will get you far if you're a young man in a young woman's window. She let him stay. And when he left, she didn't think she needed to tell the sorcerer about him. So he came back. And they became friends, or maybe more than friends, because they started talking about going somewhere else, far away from towers and sorcerers. The young man said, "Rosemary, how would you get out of the tower?" She said, "That's the easy part." And she cut off the braid, tied it to the hook by the window. Said 1 minute, and she went over to the sorcerer's workbench. She found 3 small nuts. Each one of those nuts was carved the face of an animal. The first one was carved with the face of a dog. The second one, a lion. And the third had the face of a wolf. And she slipped those nuts into a pouch on her belt, climbed down the braid, and the two rode off. But there's no sneaking out of the sorcerer's tower. He knew the moment she cut off the braid. He came as quick as he could, but the braid was all that was left. So he scrambled up that braid, went over to his workbench, took out his magic eye and his 7-league boot. And going over to the window, he searched through the wilderness until he found the young couple, put on his 7-league boots, and then off he went. 7 leagues with every step. He was soon catching up. But Rosemary saw him coming, and she pulled that first nut out of her pocket, the one with the face of a dog, tossed it over her shoulder. When it hit the ground, up sprang a huge bull mastiff with huge jowls and sharp teeth and drool flying in every direction, and he was growling and fierce, and the sorcerer had to deal with that. He conjured up a flock of birds, which he sent flying at the dog, and as the dog snapped at the birds, he stepped around, and 7 leagues with every step, he was catching up again. But Rosemary saw him coming, and she took out the second nut, tossed it over her shoulder. Up sprang a huge lion. But the sorcerer knew the plan now, and he conjured up a donkey, which he cast straight into the lion's mouth, ripping off its skin at the same time. So as the lion was struggling with the donkey's carcass, he wraps the donkey's skin around himself, camouflaged, disguised, running off to the side and up ahead to set an ambush. But Rosemary saw him, and she pulled out that last nut. And just as the sorcerer was about to pounce, she cast the nut down at his feet. Up springs a huge wolf, which swallows the donkey's skin, sorcerer and all. So he doesn't get to live forever. But Rosemary sang happily ever after.